So Donald Trump stood on a stage at an auto plant in Detroit, surrounded by workers in hard hats and safety vests, American flags behind him, cameras rolling, and announced the most aggressive auto tariff in modern trade history. He looked those workers in the eye and said, "This tariff will bring auto jobs home. For too long Canada has been building our cars with our technology and taking jobs that belong to American workers. That ends today." The workers cheered. The footage led every network. The White House called it the kill shot, the one economic weapon so severe that Canada's auto sector would have no choice but to surrender, relocate to the United States, or die. That was 72 hours ago. Today those same workers, the same people in the same hard hats at the same plant, are receiving layoff notices. The production lines they stood in front of during the rally are idle. The factory Trump used as his backdrop is shutting down shifts, not because Canada retaliated, not because foreign competition undercut them, because the tariff Trump promised would save their jobs, severed the supply chain that fed their factory. The Canadian parts their plant depends on, the engine components, the transmissions, the wiring harnesses, the stamped body panels that cross the border up to 17 times during a single vehicle's assembly are now too expensive to import, and there are no American replacements because the parts are specialized. The tooling is custom. Engineering is proprietary. Replacing a Canadian supplier takes years of retooling that the production line doesn't have. The tariff didn't bring auto jobs home to shut down the plants that already had them. And what Mark Carney revealed 48 hours after the tariff announcement, the deals he had quietly signed with 6 of the world's largest automakers didn't just neutralize the tariff, transformed Canada's auto sector from a branch of American manufacturing into an independent global auto hub that serves every market on Earth except the United States. Toyota, Volkswagen, Hyundai, BMW, Honda, Stellantis, 6 manufacturers, standing beside the Prime Minister of Canada announcing over $40 billion in new production facility investments in Canadian plants, not building parts for American cars, building complete vehicles for global export to the EU, to the UK, to Japan, to South Korea, to 3 billion consumers that Canada can reach through trade agreements the United States doesn't have, because the United States has spent 18 months burning every trade relationship it possessed. Warren Buffett said, "This is what happens when you try to cut one country out of a process that both countries are inside of. You cut yourself out of the car." But here's the part that turns a catastrophic policy failure into the most grotesque self-humiliation in modern presidential history. When Trump was confronted 72 hours after the rally with the layoff numbers mounting, with the plant closures spreading, with the automaker relocations announced, he didn't accept responsibility. He didn't reverse the tariff. He didn't blame his advisors or Canada or the trade system. He blamed the workers, the same workers he had stood in front of and promised to protect. He said at a press conference in response to a direct question about the Detroit layoffs, "Maybe if American workers were more competitive, maybe if they worked harder, produced more, the companies wouldn't be leaving." When you hear the full scope of the automaker relocations, what Buffett explained about why you cannot tariff half an integrated supply chain, and the split-screen footage of Trump promising to save the workers and then blaming them for their own destruction, you'll understand why this isn't just a trade policy failure. It's the most complete, self-authored humiliation a president has ever inflicted on himself. Subscribe, because the automaker announcements are still coming and the factory closures are accelerating. Let me explain what the tariff actually was and why the White House believed it would work, because the logic wasn't absurd on its face. It was wrong, catastrophically, permanently, irreversibly wrong, but it wasn't absurd. It was built on an assumption that had been true for decades, and that Trump's own policies had made false. The North American auto industry is not an American industry or Canadian industry. It is a single, integrated cross-border manufacturing system. A single vehicle, one car, one truck, one SUV, crosses the US-Canada border up to 17 times during its assembly. An engine block cast at a foundry in St. Catharines, Ontario, crosses to a machining facility in Michigan, then back to an assembly plant. In Oshawa, then back to a paint facility. In Ohio, then back to a final assembly line in Ontario. Wiring harnesses cross 3 times. Transmission components cross twice. Electronics modules cross 4 times. The car is not built in one country. It is built in both countries, simultaneously, continuously at every stage of production. The border is not a line between two industries. It is a seam running through the middle of one. The tariff imposed a punitive rate on Canadian auto components, parts, subassemblies, engines, transmissions, stampings, electronics at a level designed to make Canadian inputs economically unviable for American assembly plants. The rate was high enough that no American manufacturer could absorb it into the vehicle's price without making the vehicle uncompetitive. In the American market, the strategic logic was straightforward. If Canadian parts are too expensive for American plants will find American suppliers. Production will reshore. Canadian auto workers will lose their jobs. American auto workers will gain them. The kill shot. The logic depended on one critical assumption, that American suppliers existed to replace Canadian ones. They did not. The North American auto supply chain evolved over 50 years of integration. Canadian suppliers didn't win contracts because they were cheaper. They won them because they developed specialized capabilities, proprietary processes, and custom tooling that no American competitor matched. An engine block casting process, perfected over 3 decades at a St. Catharines foundry, cannot be replicated at a Michigan facility in 3 months. A transmission component manufactured to tolerances measured in microns at a Quebec precision shop cannot be sourced from a supplier that doesn't exist yet. The tariff assumed the supply chain was fungible, that parts are parts, that suppliers are interchangeable, that the word American could be substituted for Canadian on a purchase order, and the production line would keep running. Assumption was wrong. The supply chain is not fungible. It is specific, specialized, and irreplaceable in any time frame relevant to a production schedule. The immediate impact on American auto plants was exactly what the integrated nature of the supply chain guaranteed. Devastation not to Canada, to both sides, but the American side was the side that couldn't adapt. Within 2 weeks of the tariff taking effect, major assembly plants in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky began idling production lines. Components they needed from Canadian suppliers were now priced beyond viability. Alternative suppliers, American or otherwise, did not exist in the volume, quality, or specialization required. The plants faced a 3-way choice, each option catastrophic: absorb the tariff cost and lose money on every vehicle produced, pass the cost to consumers, and watch sales collapse as vehicles became thousands of dollars more expensive than competitors, or idle the lines and send workers home until the situation resolved. Most chose the third option. Some chose the first briefly before the losses forced them to the third. Anyway, the layoff numbers accumulated with sickening speed. 3,000 workers at a GM facility in Lansing, Michigan, a plant that had operated continuously for over 40 years. Facility whose workforce included second and third generation auto workers whose parents and grandparents had built cars on the same production lines. 4,200 at a Stellantis complex in Kokomo, Indiana, a community so dependent on the auto plant that the mayor held an emergency press conference warning that the city's tax base would collapse without it. 2,800 at a Ford plant in Louisville, Kentucky, a facility that had just completed a $200 million modernization 6 months earlier. An investment now stranded by a tariff that made the modernized lines impossible to run. 1,800 at a Honda facility in Marysville, Ohio, the first Honda plant ever built in the United States. Facility that had been held up for decades as a symbol of successful foreign investment in American manufacturing, now idling because the Canadian transmission components it depends on or priced beyond viability. These were not marginal facilities or marginal workers. These were the backbone plants of American auto manufacturing facilities that had operated continuously for decades, communities that had been built around them, school systems funded by their tax revenue, local businesses sustained by their payrolls, families whose identities were defined by the work they did inside those walls. The tariff that was supposed to protect them severed the supply chain that sustained them. The kill shot landed, but it hit the shooter. The human stories that emerged from the plant closures cut through the policy abstraction with visceral force. A third-generation auto worker in Michigan, her grandmother had worked the line at the same plant in the 1960s. Her mother in the 1990s told a local reporter, "I stood behind the president. At that rally, I was in the second row. I wore my hard hat. I clapped when he said the tariff would save us. And now, I'm cleaning out my locker. The tariff didn't save us. To shut us down. And the parts we need to reopen are being shipped to Canada." A shift supervisor in Indiana who had worked at the Stellantis facility for 22 years said, "I've survived 3 recessions at this plant. I survived the 2008 crisis. I survived COVID. I did not survive the tariff. The irony is the irony that keeps me up at night is that nobody was threatening my job. There was no competition taking my job. The president created a problem that didn't exist, announced a solution that made it worse, and now 4,000 of us are unemployed because of a policy that was supposed to help us." The United Auto Workers, the union that represents the workers Trump stood in front of, issued a statement that captured the fury of the manufacturing floor with language more direct than anything the union had published in its modern history. In 50 years of representing American auto workers, we have never seen a policy that so directly and immediately destroys the jobs it promises to protect. This tariff did not bring a single job to the United States. It is eliminated over 12,000 in the first 2 weeks alone, with projections indicating an additional 20,000 at risk within the next 60 days. The president used our members as props for a photo opportunity, and then signed the order that shut down their plants. We call on the administration to rescind this tariff immediately before the damage becomes irreversible, and we call on the president to stand in front of the workers he just destroyed and explain to them to their faces, not to cameras, why the promise he made was a lie. The governors of Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat, issued a joint statement, the first joint gubernatorial action of the conflict. Our state's auto workers are not political props. They are citizens, taxpayers, and the backbone of American manufacturing. The tariff imposed by this administration has directly caused the closure of production lines and the layoff of thousands of workers in our states. We demand immediate action to reverse this catastrophic policy error before entire communities are destroyed. The damage was already becoming irreversible because 48 hours after the tariff announcement, Mark Carney revealed what he had been building. The press conference was held at a Toyota assembly plant in Cambridge, Ontario, a facility that was already running at full capacity and was about to expand dramatically. Carney stood at a podium, positioned in front of an active assembly line, vehicles moving behind him, robots welding, workers in Toyota uniforms assembling components. The visual was unmistakable. Canadian auto Manufacturing is not shutting down, is scaling up, and it has friends, standing beside Carney in a line that stretched across the width of the plant floor were senior executives from 6 of the world's largest automakers: Toyota, Volkswagen, Hyundai, BMW, Honda, Stellantis, 6 manufacturers, representing over 40% of global vehicle production, not sending representatives, present personally executive vice presidents, heads of global manufacturing operations, regional CEOs, standing beside the Prime Minister of Canada in a Canadian auto plant. Each executive announced a major investment commitment: Toyota, a new EV assembly facility in Ontario, $3 billion, producing vehicles for export to the European and Asian markets under CTA and CPTP agreements. Volkswagen expansion of its existing Canadian battery plant, plus a new assembly facility for $500 million producing vehicles for the EU market. Hyundai, a new facility in Quebec, $2.5 billion, targeting South Korean and ASEAN markets through Canada's CPTP access. BMW, expansion of existing Canadian operations plus a new advanced manufacturing center, $3 billion with production destined for the UK under the Canada-UK trade agreement. Honda, major expansion of its Alliston, Ontario facility, $2 billion retold for global export rather than US-bound production. Stellantis, the largest single commitment, a $7 billion investment across 3 Canadian facilities, restructuring its entire North American production strategy to center Canadian plants as its global export hub. Total investment over $40 billion. 6 manufacturers, new plants expanded, facilities restructured, production strategies all aimed at global markets that Canada can access through the trade agreements it signed during the 18 months that the United States was burning its own. Carney's statement was precise, measured, and devastating in this calm. For 50 years, Canada's auto sector existed to serve the American market. Our plants built components for American assembly lines. Our workers made parts for American cars. Our economy depended on one customer, the United States. That dependency was a vulnerability, and like every vulnerability this conflict has exposed, it has now been fixed. He gestured to the executives behind him. 6 of the largest automakers on earth are standing behind me today. They are investing $40 billion in Canadian manufacturing, not because Canada offered them subsidies, because Canada offered them something more valuable: access to the European Union through CETA, access to Japan, Australia, and the Asia Pacific through CPTP, access to the United Kingdom through our bilateral agreement, access to South Korea, to ASEAN, to Latin America, to Africa through the trade relationships that Canada has built while the United States was dismantling its own. Then the line delivered with the clinical precision the world had come to expect. The president promised that his tariff would bring auto jobs to America. It brought automakers to Canada. He promised to protect American workers. He severed the supply chain that employed them. He called this the kill shot. He was right. Killed, but it killed his own auto industry, not ours. Now let me walk you through the meltdown, because this is where a policy failure becomes a personal humiliation, and where the humiliation becomes self-authored in a way that no opponent could have engineered. Trump's response to the crisis unfolded over 72 hours in a progression that body language experts, political psychologists, and crisis communications professionals have since analyzed as the most complete public disintegration of a political narrative in modern history. Each phase was more damaging than the last, not because external pressure increased, but because each statement Trump made deepened the contradiction between what he had promised and what was happening. The meltdown wasn't a single eruption. It was a slow-motion collapse, each phase stripping away one more layer of deniability until nothing was left but a man blaming the people he had promised to save. Hours 0 through 12 denial. Trump issued a statement through the press secretary describing the layoffs as temporary adjustments that are a normal part of supply chain recalibration and insisting the tariff was working exactly as planned. The statement said, American auto companies are repositioning their supply chains to prioritize American workers and American components. Short-term disruptions are expected and will resolve rapidly as production reshores to the United States. The statement contained no evidence of reshoring because no reshoring was occurring. Not a single component supplier had announced plans to open or expand American operations. Production was not moving to the United States. It was moving to Canada. The denial phase lasted 12 hours. The time it took for the layoff numbers to become too large to describe as temporary adjustments. Hours 12 through 24 blame the advisors in an unscheduled appearance in the White House briefing room, a setting that signaled the crisis had escalated beyond the press secretary's ability to manage. Trump said, "My team told me this tariff would work quickly. They said Canadian suppliers would have no choice but to relocate here. They said the reshoring would begin within weeks. They gave me projections, bad projections, wrong projections, maybe the worst projections anyone has ever given a president. I'm looking very carefully at who gave me this information, and there are going to be changes, believe me, big changes." The Commerce Secretary, whose department had designed the tariff, produced the economic projections and briefed the president on the expected outcomes, was notably absent from the briefing room. Sources confirmed he had offered his resignation the previous evening, a resignation that remained in administrative limbo for the next week. Neither accepted nor rejected. Commerce Department issued no public statements of any kind. Hours 24 through 36 blame Canada and the automakers. Trump posted a series of public statements attacking the automakers who had announced Canadian investments. Toyota, Volkswagen, these companies, they're disloyal to America. Totally disloyal. They're choosing Canada over the country that made them rich. They're taking American technology, American engineering, American know-how, things that American workers developed over generations, and giving it away, giving it to Canada. We'll remember that. Remember that. And there will be consequences for any company that abandons American workers for Canadian deals. The threat rang hollow. The automakers' legal and corporate teams had already assessed the risk of American retaliation and concluded it was manageable. The companies were not abandoning American workers. They were following commercial logic. Their vehicles needed to reach customers. Canada's trade agreements provided access to 3 billion of them. America's tariff walls blocked access to its own consumers, while America's burned trade relationships blocked access to everyone else's. The math was not political. It was arithmetic. And the arithmetic said Canada. Hours 36 through 48 blame the system. Trump attacked the international trade framework itself. The WTO is rigged against America. The trade agreements are rigged against America. CTA rigged. CPTPP rigged. The whole system is designed to keep American workers down and send American jobs to other countries. Canada gets deals with Europe, deals with Japan, deals with the UK deals with everybody and we get nothing. Zero. Because the system is built against us. The irony was physically painful to anyone who understood the trade landscape. The trade agreements Canada was using, CTA,